A boy vanished in rural Texas in 2001. 5-year-old Mason Caldwell was last seen just after sunset, chasing fireflies near the fence line behind his family's trailer home. It was July, the kind of heavy, dry heat that stuck to your skin and made the nights feel slower. His stepfather told police he looked away for just 5 minutes. When he turned back, Mason was gone. No screams, no struggle, no trace. For weeks, the town of Clarendon combed the brushland with dogs, volunteers, and helicopters. But nothing turned up. No backpack, no shoe, no body. Eventually, searchers gave up. The whispers started. Maybe he wandered off? Maybe a mountain lion? Maybe he ran away. By August, Mason was another picture on a telephone pole, another cold file in a rural department with too few resources and too many excuses. The case was quietly closed. His mother moved, the stepfather stayed, the story died out. Until now, rancher Travis Hale had been running cattle across this land for 35 years. Nothing surprised him anymore. But on June 11, 2024, while clearing the skeletal remains of a long-dead Hereford cow, Travis found something wedged inside its skull that stopped him cold. At first glance, it looked like a rusted piece of wire stuck in the eye socket. He was about to yank it out and toss it when something about the curve of the metal caught his eye. A glint of dull gold, a shape too deliberate to be fencing scrap. Travis leaned in. The object wasn't wire. It was a tiny, corroded necklace chain, threaded through the bone like it had been pulled in during decomposition. Hanging from the end was a dirt-caked charm, oval with lettering barely visible under 2 decades of grime. He took it back to the barn, rinsed it under the tap, and held it to the light. One word shimmered faintly in the metal, hand-etched and crude but unmistakable. Mason. He stared at it, the name stirring something familiar in his mind. Where had he heard that? A neighbor's kid? An old ranch hand? No, not just familiar, haunting. He walked inside and typed the name into Google, Mason Missing Texas. The first result made his blood go cold. 5-year-old boy disappears from rural home in 2001. Last seen playing in family yard. There it was, little Mason Caldwell. Brown hair, bowl cut, bright green eyes, a school photo. Missing for 23 years, presumed dead. No leads. The article was old, buried in the archives of a local news station, but the story came rushing back. Travis remembered the gossip. A boy vanished from the edge of town, no witnesses, no evidence, just gone. But now, 2 decades later, his necklace was inside the skull of a cow that had been buried on Hale's ranch since around 2003. Travis picked up the phone and called the sheriff's department. The Eastland County Sheriff's Office sent out a deputy the next day, followed by 2 detectives and a forensics team. They arrived quiet and serious, not the kind of mood they usually brought to cow bone discoveries. But the moment they saw the necklace, everything changed. Deputy Sandra Clemens gently bagged it, careful not to smudge the rusted surface or disturb the chain. Forensics began marking the area where the cow's skull had been found, just beyond the property line of the old Caldwell place, now long abandoned and partially overtaken by mesquite. They fanned out with flags and metal detectors, looking for anything else that could be hidden in the dirt. "Where exactly was this cow buried?" one of the techs asked Travis. "I didn't bury it," he said. "It died out in the field. Winter of 2003, I think. We had a cold snap. Froze half the herd before I could get him inside." "Did the cow ever wander near the Caldwell property?" "They used to share a fence line with us," Travis said, pointing toward a stretch of rusty wire running between his land and the overgrown lot. "They had goats, chickens, and, kids." That last part lingered in the air. By that afternoon, they'd unearthed a child's sneaker about 20 yards from where the skull had been. Size 11, light-up sole, mostly rotted, but just visible on the underside of the tongue was a name written in faded Sharpie, M. Caldwell. Suddenly, the case wasn't cold anymore. The next day, the necklace was confirmed as a match. It had been custom-made, hand-carved by Mason's sister at Vacation Bible School a week before he vanished. She had brought it home to him, strung with cheap beads and a plastic tag that said, "Best Brother." Mason wore it every day. It had never been found, until now. By the third day, news crews were gathering in Eastland. 23 years later, a clue emerges, one reporter said. The kind of detail no one expected. A child's necklace inside a cow's skull. But how did it get there? And what else has this land been hiding? Locals started talking again. Some said they remembered the family, the mother, Dana, quiet and religious, the stepfather, Rick Barton, always scowling, often drunk, and the older sister, Beth, withdrawn, serious, barely spoke. People had whispered back then that something was off in that house. Now, whispers were turning into theories. Detectives reopened the case officially. They combed through school records, CPS reports, church notes, and old tips. A name kept popping up. Miss Linda, a Vacation Bible School teacher at Christ Hope Church. She had once filed a report about a child saying something disturbing, but the file had gone nowhere. She was still alive, still in Eastland. When detectives Laura Perez and Mike Rudd knocked on Miss Linda's trailer door on County Road 92, she didn't hesitate. "I remember him," she said, tears already welling. "Mason, he was sweet, bright. He colored outside the lines." "Do you remember what he said to you that summer?" Perez asked gently. Linda nodded. He said, "My daddy hurts my sister when she sleeps." "And you reported that?" "I told the youth pastor. He said he'd take care of it. I followed up once, but no one ever called me. Then the boy disappeared." Detective Rudd scribbled furiously in his notebook. "Do you remember when exactly he said it?" "Right after he made the necklace," Linda whispered. "It was the same day. He gave it to her, then came up to me while she was in the bathroom. He was scared." "So you're telling us Mason made this necklace and then vanished the same week?" Linda nodded slowly. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong." Out at the Caldwell property, now crumbling, abandoned, and half buried in weeds, a forensic crew began searching the area more intensively. They brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. But for now, the only undeniable evidence was the necklace. And that cow's skull, the image of it. A child's name embedded in bleached bone, haunted everyone involved. It raised more questions than it answered. How did it get there? Who put it there? And what really happened to Mason Caldwell on that quiet Texas farm in the summer of 2001? A long-buried horror was finally coming to light. In the summer of 2001, the Caldwell family lived in a weathered white farmhouse just outside Cisco, Texas, a place where cicadas hummed through the heat, the porch creaked under bare feet, and people didn't lock their doors at night. On the outside, they looked like any small-town family. Inside, things were different. 5-year-old Mason Caldwell was known around town as a curious, bright-eyed boy who followed his older sister Beth everywhere. He was the kind of child who asked too many questions, picked wildflowers for his mother, and hated wearing shoes. His teachers at the Vacation Bible School said he was always smiling, unless Rick, his stepfather, came to pick him up. Then, they said, Mason went quiet. Rick Barton had married Dana Caldwell just 2 years prior. He wasn't from Cisco. He came from Odessa, a truck driver with a hard stare and a short temper. Locals say he barely spoke when he moved in, but when he did, his words carried weight. People gave him space. Beth, Mason's 14-year-old half-sister, had been more withdrawn since Rick arrived. She stopped going to youth group. She'd stopped laughing. A few of her classmates mentioned she started wearing long sleeves even in the scorching July heat. When asked about bruises once by a teacher, she claimed she'd fallen off her bike. No one pressed further. That week in July 2001, Mason had been attending Vacation Bible School at Christ Hope Church. He loved it. There were crafts, songs, snacks, and most importantly, people who made him feel safe. Miss Linda, the Sunday school teacher, remembered him painting with too much glitter and trying to make everything green. That Tuesday, she'd handed out materials for the kids to make name necklaces for someone they loved. Mason made his for Beth. He was proud of it. A thin plastic chain strung with dollar store beads and a small golden charm shaped like a fish. In scratched block letters on the back, he wrote, "To Sissy Mason." That same night, something happened in the Caldwell living room. Mason had a bad habit of waking up in the middle of the night. He didn't like the dark, and he didn't like being alone. Around 2 a.m., he wandered out of bed and walked down the hallway barefoot, dragging a pillow behind him. The living room light was on. What he saw there would never be fully described, at least not by him. But what's known is this. Beth was on the floor, curled up and sobbing, her clothes torn. Rick was above her, drunk and furious. Dana, the children's mother, was nowhere in sight. Mason froze. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. Later, police would discover that he climbed into his mother's bed an hour later and whispered, "I saw Daddy hurting Sissy." Dana reportedly told him to go back to sleep. She would deny this in later interviews. But that's what Beth remembered. The next morning, Mason still had the necklace in his pocket. He showed it to Beth in the kitchen and told her he made it for when she was sad. He didn't know that Rick had heard him the night before. That afternoon, Mason told Miss Linda something strange during snack time. "My daddy hurts my sister when she sleeps." Linda was alarmed. She pulled him aside and gently asked more questions, but Mason got nervous and clammed up. Linda brought it to the attention of the youth pastor, who told her not to worry. "Probably just a nightmare," he said. "Those boys have wild imaginations." Still, Linda wasn't convinced. She made a note to call Child Protective Services the next morning. That call would never be made, because that evening, Mason disappeared. According to Dana and Rick, Mason had been playing in the front yard just before dinner. He had a yellow Tonka truck and was digging holes under the bird bath. Around 6:45 p.m., Dana said she called him in for dinner and he didn't answer. She looked outside. The yard was empty. At 6:58 p.m., she called 911. "I can't find my son," she told dispatch. "He was just here. He's 5. He's wearing a red shirt, blue shorts. Please, someone took him." Local deputies arrived within minutes. They scoured the property, called in neighbors, launched a search party that stretched well into the night. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters were flown overhead with heat sensors. Nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of struggle. Just a small plastic truck sitting upright in the dirt. Rick appeared to help with the search, shouting Mason's name, walking through fields, knocking on neighbors' doors. But some said he seemed off, too calm, detached. Beth, meanwhile, stayed inside. She barely spoke to anyone that night. A neighbor recalled seeing her at the window, her face pale and blank. Within 48 hours, the story hit local news. A missing boy, vanished without a trace. Detectives interviewed Dana and Rick multiple times. Both stuck to the same story. Mason was outside and then he was gone. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. But when questioned separately, Rick slipped. At one point, he referred to the toy truck as being by the barn, when it had actually been found near the bird bath. When asked how he knew about the location of a second pair of Mason's shoes behind the tool shed, he shrugged and said, "I just guessed." But these inconsistencies weren't enough for charges. Not without a body, not without a witness. Beth was interviewed too, briefly. She said nothing helpful. She stared at the floor and kept wringing her hands. She denied abuse, denied seeing anything strange. In the official report, the detectives noted, "The daughter appears extremely anxious but non-cooperative. Possible signs of trauma." CPS was scheduled to do a home visit within the week, but by then, the Caldwell family was gone. Dana, Rick, and Beth packed up and moved out of Eastland County within days. Neighbors said it was like they vanished in the night. One day the curtains were open, the next the house was empty. They left no forwarding address. The property was foreclosed the following year. The case went cold. Mason Caldwell became another missing child on the wall at the sheriff's station, a fading photo and an aging promise of justice. Every so often, someone would bring his name up in town. People would wonder, did he wander off into the woods and get lost? Was he taken by a stranger? Did someone in the house do something? But no one ever had an answer, until the day a rancher found his necklace inside a skull. 23 years after Mason's disappearance, Detective Laura Perez stood inside the hollowed-out remains of the Caldwell house, flashlight beams sweeping across walls that had warped under years of heat, rain, and silence. The air smelled of mildew and mouse droppings. The floorboards groaned under every step. But this was where it happened. Somewhere in these walls, a child had seen something so horrifying that it sealed his fate before he even understood what he was looking at. Perez had been with the Texas Rangers for 7 years. She'd seen runaways, staged abductions, and more family violence than she cared to remember. But this case had gotten under her skin. The necklace, the cow skull, the rumor that Mason told someone, "Daddy hurt Sissy." And now, a piece of testimony the original investigation never got. A church volunteer who remembered Mason whispering those words the day before he vanished. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was a cover-up. And she had a sinking feeling it started inside this house. Perez stepped into the living room, the exact spot where Mason was believed to have wandered one summer night and seen his stepfather assaulting Beth. She knelt down, shining the flashlight under the couch frame left behind. The floor beneath it was deeply scratched. Not unusual, except the scratches weren't random. They were in clusters, short and furious, like a scuffle had happened right there. A child scrambling, a girl struggling. She photographed the floor. Then, in the hallway, she found something else. A small wooden cross snapped in half, stuffed into the baseboard. Beth had been religious, according to her former classmates. She carried a cross pendant to school every day. Was this hers? Had she hidden it? Broken it? Something had broken in this house. And Mason, small, observant Mason, had walked straight into it. Back at the sheriff's office, Perez and her partner, Detective Mike Rudd, pieced together everything they now knew. Mason had witnessed Rick assaulting Beth on the night of July 10th, 2001. He told his mother something vague but alarming. "I saw Daddy hurting Sissy." The next day, he told a vacation Bible school teacher, "Daddy hurts her when she sleeps." That night, he vanished. Within days, the family packed up and left town. 23 years later, Mason's necklace was found embedded in the skull of a cow that died near the family's backyard in 2003. None of that pointed to a stranger. Perez stared at a map of the old Caldwell property. The pasture where the cow had died butted up against a wooded area. No one had searched that stretch in years, and Rick Barton, now living under a different name in Oklahoma, had never faced a single charge. Yet, they found Beth living in Colorado under a different last name. She'd married young, divorced quietly, and never had children. Her job history was a patchwork of temp work, house cleaning, retail. She had no criminal record, no social media footprint for over 10 years. Perez tracked her down to a small apartment in Pueblo. When Beth opened the door and saw the badge, she didn't ask why they were there. She didn't run. She simply stepped aside and said, "I knew this day would come." Inside, Beth sat on the edge of the couch, knees shaking, eyes downcast. Perez asked gently, "Beth, we're reopening Mason's case. A piece of evidence was recovered on a ranch near your childhood home. A necklace. Mason's necklace." Beth blinked hard. "You made it for him," Perez said, "at Vacation Bible School." Beth nodded. Her voice came out flat, haunted. "It had a fish on it. I carved his name. He gave it back to me that night." "That night?" Rudd asked. the night he saw what Rick did to me. Perez leaned in. Beth, we believe Mason saw something. We also believe that's why he disappeared. Did Rick do something to him? Beth let out a ragged breath. I don't know what happened after I went to bed, but I know what I heard. She swallowed. Rick was drunk, angry. He knew Mason saw us. He said he was gonna ruin everything. I begged him not to touch Mason. I told him he's just a kid. He doesn't understand. But Rick, he got this look on his face. Cold, like all the light was gone. What did you hear? Perez asked. I heard the back door open. Beth whispered. Footsteps. Then silence. Nothing for a long time. She started to cry. The next morning, Rick said Mason had wandered off, told Mom to call 911 and cry or people would think she had something to do with it. And she went along with that? Rudd asked. She always went along with Rick, always. She thought if she protected him, he'd stop. He never did. Beth explained how, within days, Rick had forced them to move out. He said the sheriff was sniffing too close. They packed what they could and left in the middle of the night. Rick never explained what happened to Mason, never mentioned him again. I wanted to run, Beth said, but I was 14. Where could I go? She showed them a box of old belongings, one of the only things she'd kept from that life. Inside was a torn Bible, a Polaroid of Mason at the lake, and a hospital bracelet from a 2001 ER visit. The reason? Fall injury. Beth stared at it. It wasn't a fall. Perez returned to Texas with a new witness and a sworn affidavit. Within a week, a warrant was issued for Rick Barton. He was arrested at a gas station outside Tulsa. When confronted with the evidence, the necklace, the floor scratches, Beth's statement, he didn't deny it. I told the boy to keep his mouth shut, Rick muttered during questioning. He wouldn't listen. So you silenced him? Perez asked. Rick looked away. He wouldn't stop crying. Where did you put him? A pause. Then, the cow field. I didn't know they still grazed out there. It was the closest thing to a confession they would get. What remained of Mason Caldwell was later recovered in the pasture near where the cow's skull had been found. The necklace must have been pulled into the animal's skull during decomposition, a horrific, accidental preservation of truth. But the truth had come out, not through a heroic rescue or a last-minute save, but because something in the earth gave Mason back. Something he wasn't supposed to see had been buried for decades, but not anymore. After Rick Barton's arrest, word spread fast in Eastland County. And just as quickly, old memories came rushing back. Neighbors who hadn't uttered the Caldwell name in 2 decades found themselves revisiting buried conversations, uneasy moments, things they had seen or heard and brushed aside. Because now they knew the truth. Mason Caldwell didn't wander off. He didn't get lost, wasn't kidnapped by a stranger, wasn't spirited away, like some whispered. He was murdered by the man who should have been protecting him. And the silence that followed, the quiet, deliberate refusal to dig deeper, was just as damning. And that silence began at home. Dana Caldwell had been the first line of defense. Mason's mother, Beth's mother. And yet, when presented with signs of violence, she turned away. Detectives re-examined Dana's role after Rick's confession. They interviewed her at her new home in Abilene, where she lived under her maiden name and worked at a bakery. She looked older, heavier, tired. She didn't try to hide her past. I didn't kill my son, she said. No, Detective Perez replied, but you helped bury him, in your own way. Dana sat with her arms crossed. I didn't know what he was going to do. I thought Mason ran off. That's what Rick told me. Beth says Mason told you Rick was hurting her, Perez said. Dana looked away. He said something, but kids exaggerate. I just thought he was confused. You chose not to believe him. Tears welled up in Dana's eyes. "You don't understand what Rick was like." "We understand perfectly," Perez said. "So did Mason." Rick Barton had a history, not of violent arrests, but of quiet warnings. In Odessa, before he moved to Cisco, police were called once for domestic disturbances. No charges. A neighbor later told investigators that he'd heard a girl screaming in that house more than once. But nothing stuck. Small towns protect their own. They don't like to get involved in other people's families. And that's exactly what allowed Rick to thrive. Silence. Beth's silence. Dana's silence. The silence of a church that was warned and did nothing. Christ Hope Church, where Mason had attended vacation Bible school the week before his death, came under fresh scrutiny. Detectives interviewed Pastor Alan Franks, who had run the church for 35 years. His voice trembled when they showed him Mason's school photo. "I remember him," he said. "Sweet boy, always barefoot." "Do you remember Miss Linda reporting something?" Perez asked. Franks looked away. "She mentioned something. A boy said something about abuse. I didn't know it was Mason." "She says you told her you'd take care of it." Franks didn't answer. "She also says she followed up. You told her not to worry." Franks rubbed his temples. "Do you know how many kids come through our doors each summer? You hear stories. Sometimes they're just confused." "And sometimes," Rudd said coldly, "they're trying to tell us they're in danger." Franks lowered his head. The detectives would later discover that no report had been filed, no CPS alert, nothing. A handwritten note in a church logbook marked "Child Concern" was dated July 10, 2001, the day before Mason disappeared. The town of Cisco had turned the other way for years. Even after the Caldwells left, there were rumors. One woman recalled seeing bruises on Beth's arm at a grocery store. A neighbor said Rick used to shout late into the night. Another remembered Mason coming to her yard and saying, "Mommy cries a lot when Daddy yells." But no one had acted. No one had called authorities, because back then people believed in minding their business. Now they realized what that had cost. Beth struggled the most with the silence. After giving her statement, she agreed to return to Texas for the trial, something that would force her to sit just feet away from the man who had terrorized her and murdered her brother. She stayed in a safe house with trauma counselors. The first night, she barely slept. "I used to think it was my fault," she told Detective Perez, "that if I had just screamed louder or told someone sooner or, I don't know." "You were a child," Perez said. "The people who failed you were the adults." Beth shook her head. "I gave Mason that necklace. He gave it back the night before he disappeared, like he knew something bad was going to happen." Perez said nothing. "There was a moment," Beth whispered, "right before I went to bed. He climbed onto my lap, put his head on my shoulder, and said, 'Don't worry, I'll keep you safe, sissy.'" Her voice broke. "I didn't keep him safe." The prosecution built its case meticulously. Mason's recovered remains were limited, mostly fragments. The autopsy could not determine an exact cause of death, but the circumstantial evidence was damning. Rick's inconsistent statements, Beth's sworn testimony, the recovered necklace, forensic evidence placing Mason's possessions near the location Rick admitted to using, and his partial confession he wouldn't stop crying. The trial was held in the neighboring county to avoid bias. Dana Caldwell was subpoenaed, but chose to plead the Fifth. The courtroom sat in stunned silence when Beth took the stand and described the years of abuse, and the night Mason saw it all. In the end, the jury deliberated for just 6 hours. Rick Barton was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years without parole. It wasn't enough to bring Mason back, but it was something. Something after 2 decades of nothing. Beth was allowed to give a statement at sentencing. "My little brother saw something no child should ever see, and instead of protecting him, the people in his life, including me, stayed quiet. I live with that every day. But I'm done being quiet. Mason's voice is louder than ever now, and I hope Rick hears it in his sleep." She paused, then added, "You buried him. But the earth didn't keep your secret." The cow's skull, with the necklace still strung through its eye socket, was preserved in evidence. It would later be turned over to Mason's surviving family, but Beth refused to take it. "Let it stay in the courthouse," she said. "Let people see it. Let them know what happens when you silence a child." That necklace, once a gift of love from a little brother to his sister, had become something more, a warning, a symbol of how truth finds a way to claw itself out of the ground, even after decades, even after a town stops looking. The necklace was no longer just a trinket. It had become the most haunting piece of evidence in one of Texas's most disturbing cold cases, and an accidental monument to a little boy who tried to tell the truth before anyone wanted to hear it. After the trial, the necklace was carefully removed from the skull and preserved in a clear forensic display case. Though its chain was rusted and brittle, and the charm pitted from years inside the earth or inside the cow's skull, the word Mason was still visible under the right light. A small bead, green and cracked, clung stubbornly to the end of the chain. Forensic texts said it looked like it had melted into the bone over time, as if the earth itself had fused the boy's memory to something living, then dying, then buried. Detective Laura Perez stared at the display in the sheriff's evidence locker for several long minutes before speaking. "Every now and then," she said to her partner Rudd, "the world doesn't let monsters get away with it. It just waits for the right moment." The discovery of the necklace was almost pure chance. Rancher Travis Hale had only gone into the west pasture because the summer drought had exposed dozens of old bones. A veterinarian had warned him the decay could attract predators. He decided to clear it out. Most of the carcasses were from animals lost during the brutal winter of 2003. When temperatures dropped to the teens overnight and livestock froze before morning, that cow, the one whose skull had held the necklace, was believed to have died of cold and starvation near the fence line. It had never been buried, just left to decay. The soil in that area was hard clay. Over the years, wind and shifting ground had buried parts of it naturally. But the necklace, looped or snagged onto the animal's body somehow, had stuck. Experts could only theorize how it ended up inside the skull. Some believed the cow had ingested it along with dirt and feed. Others suspected the necklace had been lying near or inside the rib cage during decomposition. And over time, as the body collapsed and scavengers scattered bones, it was somehow pulled into the skull cavity, eventually getting lodged inside. However it happened, it was grotesque. And it was impossible to ignore. The forensic anthropologist assigned to the case, Dr. Miranda Liu, gave a grim breakdown of the timeline. "We estimate the cow died between January and March 2003. That lines up with records of livestock loss in the area and weather reports from that winter. The skull was relatively intact, and the necklace was embedded in such a way that suggests it was present at the time of the cow's decay. So the necklace had been outside, exposed, when the cow died?" Perez asked. "Likely," Liu replied, "or placed with a body, possibly Mason's, that decomposed nearby." This theory, though horrifying, tracked with what Rick Barton had eventually muttered during interrogation. "I put him by the cow field. Figured animals would take care of it." In other words, Rick hadn't buried Mason at all. He'd left his stepson's body out in the open, where scavengers and time would erase the evidence. But one thing hadn't gone away: the necklace. It stayed, long after Mason's bones had been scattered, long after Rick and Dana fled the town, long after the locals stopped asking questions. That necklace, made of plastic beads, a dollar store chain, and a gold-plated fish charm, refused to disappear. The skull and necklace quickly drew media attention once the case went public. News anchors used phrases like macabre twist, bizarre clue from beyond the grave, and haunting artifact of a child's final moments. But Detective Perez hated those headlines. "This isn't a ghost story," she told one reporter. "It's a story about silence. A boy spoke up and no one listened." Still, the image captivated people. The necklace, fused into bone. The child who vanished. The accident of nature that led to justice. It struck something deeper, a reminder of how easily vulnerable children are silenced and how rarely the truth surfaces once it's buried. Community response to the necklace and the case reopening was swift. People who had once remained silent began to come forward, leaving anonymous tips, emails, letters. One man, a retired fence installer, wrote, "In 2002, I worked on repairs along the west pasture of the Caldwell place. I saw bones I thought were deer. The smell was bad, but Rick said, 'Just some old livestock, don't worry.' He paid me extra to work fast." Another note, handwritten and unsigned, read, "I saw Rick dragging something across the field one night. Thought it was a hog. Should have said something." The guilt rippled out in every direction. Even Miss Linda, the church volunteer who had tried to report Mason's cry for help, broke down during an interview. "I should have called the state myself," she said, sobbing. "I trusted the church. I thought they'd follow up. He was just 5. Just 5. After the trial, Beth Caldwell returned briefly to Eastland to visit what remained of the old house. She didn't go inside, just stood at the edge of the property line where the pasture began, the same field where the cow had died, the same dirt where her brother had been discarded. She carried a small wooden cross, not the broken one, a new one. She placed it in the ground, pressed her palm against it, and whispered something no one else heard. When asked later if she wanted the necklace back, she shook her head. "That's not mine anymore," she said. "That belongs to whatever part of the earth decided not to keep secrets." Eventually, the sheriff's office created a small exhibit in the town hall. They didn't sensationalize it. Just a glass case with a photo of Mason, a copy of the missing poster from 2001, and the necklace suspended inside. A plaque read, "For Mason Caldwell, born 1996, vanished 2001, found 2024. May we listen sooner next time." It became a quiet place people visited during lunch breaks, after church, or when they needed to remind themselves that the past doesn't stay buried forever, and that some truths, no matter how small or fragile, can outlast the lies, even if it takes a cow's skull to bring them home. Beth Caldwell had spent most of her life trying to disappear. After the night Mason vanished, she folded into herself, retreating inward, becoming quieter, smaller, less visible. It wasn't just trauma. It was survival. For years, she lived in the shadow of what she had seen and of what she didn't say. Now, at 37, Beth sat in the witness room of the courthouse, watching through the glass as court officials handled evidence bags. One contained a small pair of sneakers, size 11 light-up soles found near the skull. Another contained the necklace. She hadn't touched it since that day at Vacation Bible School. She hadn't told the full truth either. Not to the police, not in court, not even during the emotional victim statement she read before Rick's sentencing. There was one part of the story she had never spoken aloud. But now, she was ready. Back in 2001, Beth was 14 and living in a prison with no bars, just walls thick with secrets, fear, and denial. Rick Barton had been in her life since she was 11. At first, he'd been cold but not cruel. Then came the small things, slamming doors, yelling too loudly, brushing too close. Her mother, Dana, insisted he was just tired or working through stress. Then it escalated. By 13, Beth was enduring what no child should ever face. The abuse was calculated, quiet, and always followed by threats. "If you tell," Rick would hiss. "They'll take you away and lock you up. They'll say you wanted it." She believed him. He controlled everything, her clothes, her food, her movements. He monitored what she said at school. And her mother, lost in denial and fear of abandonment, looked the other way. But Mason saw everything. Mason had a way of creeping into rooms without a sound. He didn't understand the things he was seeing, but he knew they were wrong. He once told Beth, "Rick makes you sad." She smiled and told him not to worry. But one night in July, Mason woke up and saw too much. He saw Rick hurting Beth, not yelling, not spanking, hurting her. The next morning, Beth found Mason sitting in the kitchen with his cereal, legs swinging off the chair. He looked at her and said, "I told Mommy what I saw." Beth froze. He pulled the necklace from his pocket, the one she'd made for him, and handed it to her. "You should wear it now," he said, "so you feel brave." She hugged him, tight, too tight. If she had told someone then, really told them, would he still be alive? Beth never knew what Rick said to Mason that day. She never saw the moment it happened. Only later did she realize the house had gone too quiet. She remembered sitting in her room, reading a library book, when she heard the back door close. It was dusk. Rick came in a few minutes later, washed his hands, and said Mason had run off. That was all. No panic, no searching, just that. And Dana, as always, accepted the lie. "We'll call the police," she said, crying into Rick's chest while he wrapped a steady arm around her. Beth stayed silent. She knew Mason hadn't run off. She could feel it in her bones. She didn't ask questions. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She buried the scream inside her and let it rot. After they moved away, the silence followed her. Rick didn't lay a hand on her again. Not after Mason. But the threat lingered. Dana remained emotionally absent. She refused to speak about the past. "God will take care of it," she'd say. "Let the Lord judge." Beth stopped going to church. By 17, she ran away, took a bus to New Mexico and used a fake name. She cleaned motel rooms and ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. Eventually, she got her GED. Later, she found work in a bookstore, then a pharmacy. No friends, no boyfriends, no questions. She lived in fragments. She drank too much, smoked alone, went months without saying her real name out loud. But every year, on July 11th, the day Mason disappeared, she lit a candle and left it on the windowsill. Just one flicker of truth in a life full of shadows. When Perez first contacted her in 2024, Beth considered ignoring the message, but something in her cracked open. Maybe it was time. Maybe it had always been time. She told the detectives about the abuse, about Rick, about Mason's last words. She gave them her statement, but there was one thing she hadn't said. Something she couldn't quite name until the trial was over. Now she was sitting in a therapist's office, hands clenched, the room silent but warm, safe. The therapist gently asked, "Beth, do you want to tell me what else happened that day?" Beth nodded. "I found something." Hours after Rick said Mason had run off, Beth had wandered outside. She knew the truth. She just couldn't face it. She walked to the edge of the field toward the goat shed and stopped dead in her tracks. There, just past the tall grass, was Mason's red t-shirt, crumpled, dirty, lying under a bush. No sign of blood, just dropped. She stood frozen. Then slowly, she walked over and picked it up. Underneath, buried barely an inch in the dirt, was Mason's Tonka truck. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She buried the shirt and toy in a shallow hole under the shed. Why? Because Rick had told her he'd kill her if she talked. Because her mother had already chosen sides. Because part of her believed it was too late. And because some part of her, twisted and broken from years of abuse, thought it was her fault. Beth finally told the police about the shirt and toy in 2024. They found them exactly where she said, still wrapped in a piece of blue plastic under what remained of the old shed foundation. They had degraded badly, but it was something. Another confirmation of Mason's final moments, another piece of the truth. Perez asked her why she hadn't told them sooner. Beth looked her in the eye and said, "Because I spent 23 years thinking no one would believe me. Why would they? No one did before." Now Beth was rebuilding, slowly, carefully. She had begun using her real name again. She joined a survivors support group. She started therapy. She even began writing, journaling her memories, her dreams, her fears. In one entry, she wrote, "He was 5. He gave me a necklace and told me to be brave. He didn't get to grow up, but I will, for him." In the end, Beth wasn't just a sister to a murdered child. She was a survivor of abuse, a witness to evil, and ultimately the one who chose to speak when silence had nearly won. Justice came, but not in time. Not in time to save Mason, not in time to stop Rick Barton from stealing 23 years of truth, not in time to keep Beth from spending her entire adolescence thinking her silence had murdered her brother. The justice that finally arrived in Eastland County was slow, bitter, and soaked in regret. Detective Laura Perez had worked dozens of cases, but none like this. None where a 5-year-old's voice had been ignored, erased, and then rediscovered inside the skull of a long-dead animal. It still haunted her. She thought about it while brushing her teeth, while driving, while watching her own niece play in the front yard. "This one doesn't go away," she told her partner Rudd. "Even when it's over, it's not. Because what do you even call this? Justice delayed? Justice neglected? Justice too late?" Maybe the better word was mourning, not just for Mason, but for everything and everyone that failed him. The trial had ended. Rick Barton was locked away, but that didn't close the wound. Beth's testimony had been headline news, her quiet voice describing years of abuse, her tearful explanation of Mason's final mourning. But afterward, when the cameras were gone and the crowd stopped watching, it was silence again. A different kind. Not the kind that hides evil, the kind that lingers after tragedy. Perez filed the last of the paperwork, boxed the evidence, and archived the case under Caldwell Mason, homicide resolved. But it didn't feel resolved. It felt like an old, heavy door had been opened, only to reveal a room that had been full of rot all along. And then came the public reaction. People in town were furious and ashamed. Cisco had always been a tight-lipped place. Neighbors waved, pastors preached, but people didn't ask questions. That culture, that refusal to get involved, had allowed monsters like Rick Barton to thrive. Now the whole town was reckoning with it. The church that had once dismissed Miss Linda's warning issued a public apology. Pastor Franks resigned. The local elementary school instituted new training for staff, how to handle vague or offhand comments from children. The sheriff's office opened a hotline for victims of historical abuse, even from decades ago. It was too late for Mason, but maybe, just maybe, someone else might be saved. As for Dana Caldwell, Mason's mother, her story unraveled in the press like a slow-motion collapse. She refused to testify at Rick's trial, invoking the Fifth repeatedly. But the public saw right through it. They remembered the crying mother on the news in 2001, pleading for her son's return. And now they saw a woman who had ignored the warnings of both her children and protected the man who killed her son. Reporters camped outside her house. She gave no interviews. One local news outlet obtained documents revealing that Dana had received disability benefits and housing vouchers for trauma related to a missing child for years after Mason disappeared. After the conviction, those benefits were revoked. Legally, she hadn't committed a crime, but morally, she was exiled. She disappeared from public life. Her bakery closed. Her name disappeared from the church registry, and perhaps most hauntingly, she never once contacted Beth. Not after the trial, not after the arrest, not even after the truth came out. In a letter to her therapist, Beth wrote, "My mother lost 2 children, one to murder, one to silence, and she doesn't speak to either of them." Rick Barton died just 6 months into his sentence, a massive stroke in the prison infirmary. No next of kin claimed the body. The state cremated him and buried the ashes in an unmarked grave. Some people called it justice. Beth called it cowardice. "He didn't even have to sit in that cell and rot," she said. "He didn't live with what he did. I did." And still, she refused to visit the grave. He's not worth the gas. The one good thing to come from it all was what people started calling Mason's Law. Beth, with support from Detective Perez and a growing number of victims' advocates, began pushing for legislation in Texas that would require all verbal disclosures of abuse by children, even vague ones, to be formally documented. Any adult who receives such a statement and fails to report it to face legal consequences. Mandatory follow-up within 48 hours for any child under 10 making abuse-related disclosures. It was a long process. It took 2 years. But in April 2027, Mason's Law passed unanimously in the Texas state legislature. Beth was there, sitting quietly in the back, holding a framed picture of her little brother. When the governor signed the bill, she wept silently. Later, she spoke to a small crowd of reporters. "This law doesn't bring Mason back. It doesn't give me my childhood. But maybe it'll keep another kid from being ignored. Maybe someone will listen next time." Beth eventually moved to Austin. She found a small apartment, adopted a dog, and enrolled in community college. She began studying psychology with a focus on trauma recovery. Her therapist called it turning pain into purpose. Some days were still hard. Loud noises startled her. She still didn't like closed doors. But she was healing. Slowly, painfully, genuinely. One fall morning, she got a package in the mail from the sheriff's office. Inside was the necklace. She hadn't asked for it. She'd even told them to keep it in the exhibit. But a note inside read, "He wanted you to be brave. You were. He'd be proud. L. Perez." Beth sat on the edge of her bed, holding the necklace in her palm. It was ugly now. The chain rusted, the charm dull, but it was the most precious thing she owned. She hung it on the wall beside Mason's photo. Then she lit a candle and let herself cry. Not from guilt, not from rage, but because after all these years, someone had finally listened. It wasn't Rick Barton's hands that killed Mason Caldwell. Not exactly. It was silence. That slow, suffocating hush that follows abuse in families, churches, schools. The one that cloaks itself in denial, in fear, in shame. That silence moved through every adult who saw something, heard something, felt something was wrong, and said nothing. It allowed a predator to move freely. It left a child defenseless. It buried the truth deeper than any grave ever could, and in Mason's case, it nearly succeeded. Even after Rick Barton's confession and conviction, Detective Laura Perez couldn't stop replaying a question in her mind. What if someone had spoken up sooner? What if Dana had believed her son instead of protecting her partner? What if the church had reported the warning from Vacation Bible School? What if a neighbor had walked across the street and knocked on the Caldwell's door when they heard screaming? What if Beth had felt safe enough to tell someone? Each what if twisted Perez's stomach. Because the answer was always the same. Mason would still be alive. He'd be a grown man now, 28 years old, maybe married, maybe coaching Little League, maybe just another young Texan in a pickup truck with the windows down, radio loud. But instead, his name became a headline. And his final words, "I'll keep you safe, sissy," became a cruel echo of a promise a child couldn't keep, because the adults around him failed to keep theirs. Silence killed Mason, but not just the kind imposed by fear. also the kind that grows in places where people confuse privacy with protection, where families treat abuse as nobody's business, where churches say, "Let's pray on it," instead of picking up the phone and calling child services. That's what happened in Cisco. It wasn't just one man's violence, it was a whole community's indifference. And that's what Beth Caldwell set out to change. After the trial, Beth didn't return to her old life. She built a new one rooted in speaking out. She began visiting schools, talking to counselors about signs of domestic abuse, not as a survivor, not as a victim, but as a witness. A witness to what happens when silence is chosen over action. In one middle school, she told a group of 8th graders, "If someone tells you something that sounds scary, don't ignore it. Don't convince yourself it's not real. Believe them. That might be the only time they say it." The room was dead silent. One boy raised his hand and asked, "But what if they get mad at you?" Beth smiled sadly. "They might, but it's better to have someone angry at you than someone buried because you stayed quiet." The silence that killed Mason also shaped Beth's entire life. She lived in its shadow for years, and it made her mistrust everything: people, systems, even herself. That's the real legacy of abuse. It doesn't end when the bruises fade. It continues in the questions that never get answered, in the trust that never comes back. She once wrote in her journal, "I spent so long trying to forget that I forgot who I was." The silence didn't just hide the truth, it erased me too. But the discovery of Mason's necklace, that grotesque accident of nature, cracked the silence open. Suddenly, people were listening, not just to the story, but to her. And when they listened, they started seeing what had been there all along. Mason's case became more than a tragedy. It became a symbol. Articles were written, documentaries proposed, true crime forums lit up with theories and timelines and anger. But the most powerful conversations happened quietly, in living rooms, classrooms, church basements, where parents began asking harder questions. Are my kids safe? Would I know if something was wrong? Would I believe them? For Beth, that shift was more valuable than justice in the courtroom. "It won't bring Mason back," she said during a radio interview, "but maybe it'll save someone else. That's all I want." Detective Perez received hundreds of emails in the months after the trial, many from strangers who said Mason's story helped them speak up. One woman wrote, "I saw your case on the news. I realized the things my uncle did to me weren't just bad dreams. I told my husband I'm starting therapy." A teacher said, "A 2nd grader in my class said something strange about her stepdad. Normally I'd let it go. This time I reported it. Turns out she was being abused. Thank you for reminding me that little voices matter." Even Miss Linda, the VBS volunteer who tried to raise the alarm all those years ago, found her voice again. She organized a memorial in Mason's name, not a funeral, a vigil, a space for people to finally say the things they never did. The vigil was held at dusk in the same park where the original search parties had gathered in 2001. Beth stood near the front, holding a small candle. She watched as people placed flowers beneath a new plaque the city had erected. It read, "In memory of Mason Caldwell, 1996 to 2001. A voice we failed to hear, a light we won't let fade. Children from the local elementary school handed out flyers that listed signs of abuse and hotline numbers. One boy clutched a copy of Mason's missing poster, now wrinkled and water-stained, and asked Beth, "Was he your brother?" She nodded. "He still is." When the crowd thinned, Beth walked to the edge of the park. She pulled Mason's necklace from her coat pocket. She never wore it. Too fragile, too sacred. But tonight she held it tight. She whispered, "I'm sorry, I didn't protect you, but I promise. I'm making sure someone listens this time." Then she lit her candle and let the flame flicker in the Texas wind. The silence that killed Mason Caldwell almost kept him hidden forever. But it didn't win, because the truth found a way back, through bone, through time, through grief. And now, his voice is louder than ever. In every tragic case, there comes a moment, not in the courtroom, not in the police station, but in the hearts of everyone watching, where a choice must be made. Will you remember this story, or will you turn the page? Because Mason Caldwell's story isn't just about what happened in 2001, or what was found in 2024. It's not just about a monster who got caught. It's not even just about a sister who found the strength to speak. It's about us, what we saw, what we missed, and what we choose to do now. You see, Mason didn't die just because of Rick Barton. He died because of every adult who looked away, every teacher who dismissed a vague comment, every neighbor who heard a scream and said nothing, every church leader who promised to take care of it and then didn't, and maybe, most tragically, because of a mother who chose love for a man over protection for her children. It's a brutal truth, but it's one we have to face, because Mason's story isn't rare. It's common, horrifyingly so. Thousands of children every year are silenced by fear, manipulation, or the crushing weight of being ignored. Some speak up once, and never again, and the world forgets them unless someone listens, unless someone refuses to stay silent. Beth Caldwell could have stayed hidden forever. No one would have blamed her. After all, she had every reason to vanish. She was a victim of abuse, a witness to her brother's murder, a child abandoned by the people who should have fought for her. She carried guilt that was never hers to bear. And yet, she came back. She testified. She spoke out. She lit a match in the middle of the darkness, and from that spark, others followed. Laws changed. Conversations began, and Mason, a little boy who had been lost in silence, was finally heard. Now, the question turns to you. If a child told you something confusing, unsettling, strange, would you listen? Would you believe them, even if it made you uncomfortable? Would you speak up, even if it meant risking friendships, jobs, or community standing? Because the truth is, you might be the only one who hears them. And if you stay silent, if you brush it off, if you look the other way, another Mason could vanish. True crime stories often end with justice or closure, but this one ends with a responsibility. Mason's case isn't meant to entertain, it's meant to warn. It's meant to make you ask, who am I protecting with my silence? Who might be suffering just out of sight? And what would I do if I saw something, if I heard something? Would I act? Or would I wait, like everyone else did in 2001? There's a line Beth once said in a quiet interview, one that wasn't picked up by the national news but stayed with the detectives, the lawyers, the people who were there. The necklace didn't bring Mason back, but it brought the truth back. And that's something the earth couldn't hide. That's what this case teaches us. Truth finds a way, no matter how deep it's buried, no matter how long the silence lasts, no matter how many people try to forget. So now we leave you with this. The next time a child says something that feels strange, the next time someone tells you about a bruise, a scream, a fear they can't explain, the next time your gut twists and you're tempted to stay out of it, remember Mason. Remember his necklace, buried in a skull. Remember a little boy who said, "I saw Daddy hurting Sissy." And remember how long it took for the world to finally listen. Because stories like this don't end on YouTube. They end, or begin, with you.